We're coming on the air with breaking news. The January 6th committee demanding answers and throwing some legal muscle behind trying to hear from another top Trump official with just a few minutes ago, a subpoena dropping for Peter Navarro. Why the panel says they want to hear about the so-called Green Bay sweep. We'll explain what that is. We're live with that, with the reporter who also caught up with the House's top Republican, who's not running away anymore from his party's legitimate public discourse line about that January 6th attack. Plus, feels like a tipping point in the fight against the pandemic today, with new divisions, not really red and blue, but between blue states and President Biden. Why the White House thinks the science says pump the brakes on lifting mask mandates, and why some governors are saying, we're doing it. To the NFL, where Commissioner Roger Goodell is acknowledging diversity in the coaching ranks fell short late this afternoon. We'll talk about what else we're hearing from him in just the last couple hours for the first time since that explosive discrimination lawsuit against the league we told you about last week. In Florida, the state's governor looks like he's throwing his support with what critics are calling the Don't Say Gay bill, what a top Biden official today is saying about it and why it's, quote, absolutely dangerous, he says, for kids. And the Super Bowl of betting coming up in a few days, the actual Super Bowl, as it gets easier than ever to gamble online. We've got a real-life look at the underside of that reality later in the show. Hey, I'm Hallie, and as we're coming on the air, we talked about this idea of a tipping point, and that is what it feels like today, with this avalanche of announcements letting up on mask mandates. Several of them just rolled out in the last couple hours. We are now up to 9 blue state governors saying it kind of seems all at once, we're not going to make you wear a mask, either inside, in public, or in schools. We heard from the governors of 4 of those states today, Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island, and Illinois, all laying out the case for why now.
Everyone now has the tools and the knowledge to stay safe with respect to COVID.
And we're not done, but this is trending in a very, very good direction, and that is why we are now approaching a new phase in this pandemic.
We based the decisions that we made today based on good data and also listening to the people in the state of Rhode Island.
We are on track to come out on the other side of this latest COVID storm in better shape than even the doctors expected.
But these choices seem to set up a clash with the White House that's not ready to go there, not yet, with the CDC director today explaining why not.
Those decisions are made at the local level. But at this time, we continue to recommend masking in areas of high and substantial transmission. That's much of the country right now in public indoor settings.
We're going to talk with Shannon Pettypiece about what the White House is thinking in just a sec. But I want to start with Gabe Gutierrez, who's looking at the view from the ground on the states, including there in New York. And there is this dichotomy, Gabe, this disconnect that has exploded into public view over the last 48 hours and is reaching this important point today where these states are saying, listen, mask mandates, it is time for them to end. The Biden administration is saying, well, we don't think so yet. We think it's still a little too soon.
Yeah, that's right, Hallie. Well, the White House did say today that it's considering some changes, at least potentially, in the future. But you're right. The White House and the CDC not going that far just yet. The governors that we've been hearing from, though, we've been hearing it over and over again. They say that they are following the science in their view. They say that the numbers have been trending down, as you just heard there. And one of the sound bites you played, Hallie, is something that I keep hearing over and over again, not just from those governors, but also from a Democratic pollster that I just spoke with, talking about how, a lot of people in these blue states now feel that they can live with this virus, or at least that there are other tools in the toolkit to be able to keep these numbers down, the vaccines, the boosters, therapeutics. And so it's kind of, they're kind of reading the room at this point.
Right.
They're really, they're looking ahead to these midterms later this year and realizing, hey, mask restrictions, COVID restrictions, mask mandates aren't quite so popular anymore.
It's so interesting how you phrase it as reading the room, because that does seem to be what it is here, even though you have some doctors who say, hey, too bad. Like, if you don't if you're trying to read the room isn't where it necessarily needs to be. Dr. Kavita Patel told me just a couple hours ago when I was chatting with her on air elsewhere that she thinks these governors are, in her words, capitulating on masking, that it's just too soon. I want to play a little bit of that.
I have tremendous respect for the CDC. I think you heard a little bit in Dr. Walensky's comments today, but I think it's just, we're ignoring the elephant in the room if we don't acknowledge everybody is tired of wearing not just masks, but the masks have become symbolic, Hallie, and reflective of everything else we have to do.
masking as a symbol at this point in some ways, in some places. But you went on to raise this point, Gabe, that is valid here, which is what happens if there is another surge? How do you then communicate to folks who may have to put masks back on?
Yeah, it's tough to put that genie back in the bottle, right? And that's a potential concern. And it is a reason, Hallie, why perhaps New York's governor, anyway, she is waiting until early March in order to get rid of the mask mandate for schools, even though some other governors have already gotten rid of mask mandates for schools. Massachusetts just announced that it would in the next couple of weeks by the end of February. But Governor Hochul here in New York, she's like, okay, no, I'm going to take a look in early March after the midwinter break, and then we'll make a decision then, kind of being extra cautious in that sense. But what Dr. Patel said, you know, it's possible there could be another variant, you know, that could be even more contagious than Omicron. But again, it's a, you know, they feel that the American public is sick of wearing masks, and so they seem to be bending to that. One more thing, Hallie, this doesn't mean that these mask mandates are going to go away for good. As you know, they're essentially punting the decision now to local authorities, and we keep hearing in places like New Jersey and here in New York City that the mask mandate and vaccine requirements for certain businesses aren't going away. It's just a statewide mandate that's going by the wayside.
Which means, you know, do you bring your mask with you? You don't have to wear it on the subway, but you do inside a bit. I mean, it creates these rules for folks as they're going about their business throughout the day. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And, you know, it takes me back to, you know, covering this pandemic for 2 years. I remember traveling around the country, you know, years ago at this point, but you know, when people weren't traveling quite so much and seeing how different, you know, we're talking about this dichotomy now in some blue states. Keep in mind, Hallie, you know, parts of the South haven't had restrictions for quite a long time. Yep. And when they, you know, some people would visit a place like New York City from other parts of the country, they would be shocked that they had to show their vaccination card to eat indoors. And that seems strange then. Now, you know, it may be where you're in one municipality in New Jersey, but then go to another place in upstate New York, and there might be this patchwork of policies that will take at least several months to sort out, Hallie.
Gabe Gutierrez live for us there with that reporting to start us off tonight from New York. Gabe, good to see you. Thank you. To Shannon Pettypiece at the White House now. So, Shannon, we heard from the White House's COVID coordinator about this idea of a return to normal, that we are going to be living with the pandemic that some of these blue state governors are talking about. Here's that.
The president, as I just mentioned, has been clear that we're moving toward a time when COVID won't disrupt our daily lives, a time when COVID won't be a constant crisis.
The question that has always existed and that comes up again today, Shannon, is, okay, well, when will that time be?
And the answer is not yet, essentially, from the CDC director when she was pressed on this. She said, you know, hospital admissions are still high. Most of the country is still in that high to substantial level of community spread. We're getting in there. We're going in the right direction, but we're not there yet. You know, I think quite a big question that they didn't really answer today on this COVID briefing with reporters was, what's the metric to know when we're there? What's the level of hospitalization that you're looking for to know when we are there? And they didn't give a clear answer to that. I mean, we've known things like around masks. Their guidance right now is when you get to that low to moderate spread in a community, and there's, you know, certain statistics about number of cases per 100,000 people that they have for that level, that at that level, they say now you can take those masks off. A lot of these states, as you and Gabe were just talking about, are getting ahead of that, you know, creating that disconnect from the CDC and that confusion potentially for people about who do I listen to, the CDC or the state officials or my local officials or county officials, as it's going to create a bit of confusion here. But that's where the administration is right now. We also know, though, that they did say today they're starting this sort of listening tour. They're reaching out to public health experts, public health officials, to governors, to talk to them about what they want to see in this next stage of the pandemic. And the administration is clearly trying to sort of start crafting some guidelines and recommendations going forward if we continue to see cases declining like they are, in addition to now having so many people vaccinated and tests widely available and some therapeutics coming on the market, things we didn't have last spring when cases came way down and the CDC said we can all take our masks off, and we saw a resurgence.
Before I let you go, Shannon, can you talk a little bit more about this point, the idea that, this question of is the Biden administration out of touch with where most Americans are? Because there's some new polling out, including one that really sticks out that says 70% of Americans agree with the statement that we have to accept that COVID is here to stay and get on with our lives. When you talk to your sources in and around the White House, Shannon, how do they respond to that piece of things?
Well, they say that that's how they feel as well, and that the president is starting to talk now about moving on from the pandemic, learning to live with the virus, about the tools that we have now, the testing, the boosters, the therapeutics that are going to get us to a new stage in the pandemic. But I think it certainly seems to see like what they're saying is we're not there yet.
Yeah.
The public might be, and of course, much of the country, as you and Gabe were talking about, hasn't been wearing masks for a long time, has moved on. They're dining indoors, and they've been out of touch, this White House, with that part of the country for a long time. But the administration says we are moving in that direction. Just give us a little bit of time. It's not today. Today's not the day to announce the next phase, at least from them and the administration's perspective.
Shannon Pettypiece live outside of the White House for us. Shannon, thank you. To that breaking news now, the House January 6th committee subpoenaing former White House trade advisor Peter Navarro, saying he reportedly worked with Steve Bannon and other people to develop this plan to delay the certification of the 2020 election results and to try and change the outcome of the legitimate election. And the committee is putting legal teeth behind this whole thing. This is a subpoena. This is not a polite request. It's a subpoena. And the chairman of the select committee is pointing out, basically, hey, Peter Navarro, you've been chatty with reporters about this plan. You've been writing about it in your book. Now come tell us. Joining me now from Capitol Hill is Garrett Haake. And Garrett, listen, there have been some high-profile people that the January 6th Select Committee has wanted to talk to. Peter Navarro is a high-profile name. He's somebody who is a television surrogate for the Trump administration at moments of key economic points. He's somebody who has been very vocal in the time since the Trump White House has left office, since Donald Trump won the election, about what the thought was, this Green Bay sweep. Explain that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a plan that was so developed it even had the catchy nickname here, Navarro and Steve Bannon, calling the plan they developed to delay, and the committee argues ultimately overturn the election results, the Green Bay sweep. And they make the argument, as you say, preemptively here, that they say Navarro shouldn't be able to get out of this by citing some kind of executive privilege or any other privilege for that matter, because he was so forward-facing, so media-facing about his plans, about his thoughts that the election was stolen, and about his desire to see, former President Trump remain President Trump. So they're trying to get out ahead of the legal arguments that they've, have flummoxed them in some other ways with folks like Mark Meadows. But yeah, I mean, Navarro and his allyship here with Steve Bannon, I think, is notable as well. Bannon was kind of the first major Trump world figure who the committee subpoenaed, ultimately held in contempt for refusing to testify. So they're kind of circling back to the heart of the matter, what got this whole investigation started in the first place.
Can you talk about why now, the timing of this, and also you referenced it briefly, the idea of the potential for Navarro to invoke executive privilege, given that, unlike some of the others who the committee wants to talk to, he was working in the Trump White House at the time?
Yeah, I could only speculate about the timing on this. With someone like Bannon, for example, the contempt tool can be useful to punish, but they can't compel testimony. And it's possible that the committee feels like there's something about this plan that is important enough that they need to try every way of getting around to getting an answer on it. They might be able to punish Bannon, but they can't make him talk. Perhaps they feel like Peter Navarro is someone who might want a different kind of career and a different kind of life than does Steve Bannon, and so he might be a little easier to squeeze in this way to get to speak on this issue, Hallie.
Garrett, the other piece of this, as we talk about January 6th, has been the fallout that we've been talking about for several days now from the Republican National Committee describing what happened on the day of the insurrection as legitimate political discourse. Kevin McCarthy is this Republican leader that we haven't heard much about. He was quite, I don't want to say literally running from cameras, but as we're showing on screen, let's say aggressively fast walking, like New York trying to get to a subway, that's running late type walking. Garrett, you caught up with him today finally and got to ask him about it, right?
I did. McCarthy said, it's clear that anyone who was engaged in violence, who was part of the riot at the building, wasn't engaged in legitimate political discourse. And he tried to clean up some of the, frankly, the own goal that has been the RNC's language on this by saying that the point they were trying to make was that the committee has gone far beyond targeting just people who were here involved in the attack itself, but rather by going after these folks who were among those alternate electors or who are in some cases apparently RNC members who were not here that day, supposedly that those are the people in the RNC's mind that were engaging in legitimate political discourse. None of that's in the resolution. So his clarifying points are noted, but it's not what the RNC voted on, and it's not, I think we can now pretty firmly establish what the vast majority of Republicans up here want to be talking about.
Of course, they're being asked about that, about the RNC's censure of Liz Cheney, of Adam Kinzinger, two Republicans in the House, too.
Yeah, and McCarthy was somewhat supportive of that action. Here's what he said to that question.
Do you agree with the decision to censure them?
The RNC has the ability to. I think there's a reason why Adam is not running again. I think there's a reason why, at the end of the day, Liz would have a hard time winning here if she runs. I don't even think she'll run.
So the reason he's clearly implying there is the idea that Kinzinger and Cheney are so out of step with the rest of the party, given their views, being part of this January 6th committee. By the way, his implication there that Cheney might not be running again for her House seat is belied by all the available evidence. She's raised gobs of money for her reelection and has made it pretty clear that she views winning that race as a battle for the soul of what it means to be a Republican right now. So I'd be very surprised to see her do anything but stick it out through her August primary.
And didn't her spokesman give kind of a sassy response on that today?
Yeah, the response, and I keep flubbing the quote, was basically that McCarthy doesn't have a long history of being honest about, particularly about other people's intentions here. So they're not biting on this at all, Hal.
Garrett Hake, live for us on the Hill. Garrett, thanks for scrambling to a camera for us on that breaking news. Appreciate it. In other news tonight, a senior U.S. defense official is telling NBC News, speaking of developing news in just the last hour or so, that the Biden administration is making plans to try to get Americans out of Ukraine if Russia does invade. And the plan, this contingency plan, would involve bringing them through Poland, where U.S. troops would be set up waiting to help them. This is all coming out not long after we heard from the Pentagon press secretary, who said the Pentagon does not currently have plans to evacuate U.S. citizens from Ukraine.
I can't rule out the fact that these soldiers could be used with to some degree with evacuation assistance on the other side of that border. And certainly they're going to be prepared to do that.
Okay, well, actually, Kirby there clearly, John Kirby, the press secretary, clearly leaving the door open to it. It seems like the White House, the Biden administration, is trying to avoid another chaotic evacuation like what we saw in Afghanistan last summer. They'd use the 82nd Airborne Division to set up checkpoints for medical screenings and some other operations. We also, by the way, learned President Biden today talked with French President Emmanuel Macron just one day after Macron had separate meetings with both Vladimir Putin and the Ukrainian President Zelensky. I want to bring in now Matt Bradley. Matt, can you tell us more about this NBC News reporting on this contingency plan, it seems, to evacuate Americans if the time comes? It feels like it can be read a couple of different ways here.
Yeah, it's like you said, Hallie, it's impossible to know, really. Is this just more of, abundance of caution given the embarrassment and the scramble that we saw after Afghanistan, or is this a real thing? Is this actually reflecting the direness of the situation? It's really hard to know exactly, and the fact is it could be either, it could be both.
There's been this question all along of when Vladimir Putin, when Russia says, oh, we're not planning to invade, that's talk, but then look at what the action is. And the action now, today, is that we're learning that Russian military commanders are now in Belarus. Is this not an escalation?
Again, here's the thing, Hallie, it's so hard to say because when you look at this situation, you really are seeing, a surrounding of Ukraine. You're seeing a crescent shape of troops all around the country from north to south. Here in Ukraine, nobody seems to be alarmed. Everybody seems to be acting as though this isn't a big deal. This is par for the course. This is almost an annual event. So as far as leadership here and the official, in public and private, the official position of the government seems to be that this isn't that big of a deal. But really, this is one of the largest marshaling of forces around the borders of Ukraine ever since World War II. So it's really hard to know. I don't know, and I think anybody who tells you they do probably doesn't have much of a clue.
You've been on the ground for us in Ukraine for weeks now, and I know you have some new reporting about people, Ukrainians, donating supplies to the Ukrainian military, right? What's the story there?
Yeah, I mean, in our hotel lobby just a little while ago, we saw, a clear plastic box that said Ukrainian military, and there was some change. There was some, bits of currency, some pocket change in there. It was as if anybody could just dump some change. And this wasn't, again, this is different from, donating money to saying that you can kind of, give money to, veterans or veterans' families. This is money going to hardware. This is money going towards the actual, military troops on the front line. And that's really different. It just goes to show the extent to which this military isn't just outmanned and outgunned, it's also outfinanced. The Russian military expenditure in 2020 was about 10 times what it was in Ukraine. And that just goes to show that this military is going to have a very, very hard time fighting on the front lines when it comes to an actual engagement, if it comes to that. Hallie?
Matt Bradley, live for us in Ukraine. Matt, thank you. The biggest game in football happens on Sunday right here on NBC. But today, the focus is what's happening off the field. Because you had the NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell holding what's usually a pretty celebratory news conference. He does it every year ahead of the Super Bowl. Typically, it's like, talking about what the league did, et cetera. Well, this time, he's having to face some really tough questions, specifically on these allegations of racism and discrimination inside the NFL. He's now acknowledging that the league has fallen short on hiring diverse head coaches. He was answering questions about this lawsuit we told you about, filed by former Miami Dolphins head coach Brian Flores, who's suing the league for racial discrimination. Here it is directly from the commissioner himself. Listen.
I think we made a tremendous amount, a lot of progress in a lot of areas, but not at the head coach. And that is something that we really have focused on to try to get the kind of results that we would expect. And we fell short of that.
Morgan Chesky is following this story for us. So, Morgan, what you heard from Commissioner Goodell there was an acknowledgement that the NFL is not where he would like it to be. But what you didn't hear, at least in that particular part, was steps that the NFL is going to take to try to rectify it ASAP. Tell us more.
Yeah, those steps will be ones that everyone will be keeping a very close eye on, Hallie, because over the course of this press conference, we heard Roger Goodell essentially acknowledge that they have not been where they need to be, that there is no finish line when it comes to diversity, and that no solution is off the table here. They were talking about the Rooney Rule in particular. This was enacted back in 2003, where teams had to interview a minority candidate for a head coaching position. It was amended in 2020 to make that 2 minority candidates. And with this recent class action lawsuit from former Dolphins coach Brian Flores, it's back in the spotlight yet again. Some even saying that it needs to be looked at to be done away with entirely. Goodell says he wants to facilitate a dialogue, a conversation, re-examine this rule, how useful it is. He wants to talk to consultants to look at how the league is currently being managed from a hiring standpoint as well. And that was one of the key things we heard from him, really speaking publicly for the first time since this massive lawsuit came out, not only alleging racial discrimination against the NFL, but also the New York Giants, the Denver Broncos, and the Miami Dolphins organization. So it'll be interesting to see what comes of this, but Goodell was very intent on putting this Rooney Rule back in the spotlight yet again to see if it should even stay around. That was also being discussed as well.
What did you make of Goodell's tone when talking about this? Because immediately after this Flores lawsuit came out, and we reported it in real time here on the show, the NFL came out and pretty aggressively said it was without merit here.
Right. It was interesting when he was asked specific points in this lawsuit. He was quick to say that the courts will settle the legal aspects of this. But then he took a moment to say that the claims being made by former Dolphins head coach Brian Flores should also be listened to as well. And he had this to say on that subject. Take a listen.
It's more important for us to sort of listen to Coach, understand what he and other coaches are going through, what our clubs are going through, what the feedback they have, and also, again, reevaluate everything we're doing. Let's see, are we making mistakes that we subconsciously are doing or didn't think was a mistake? We have to reopen every one of those.
And of course, the Rooney Rule will be front and center in these ongoing conversations. Since its founding in 2003, 122 head coaches have been hired in the NFL. All but 17 of them have been white. Hallie?
Before I let you go, Morgan, there's this other story that is of great interest, not just where I am in Washington, but around the country for people who follow the NFL. And that's this investigation into the Washington Commanders, the team here in D.C., and these allegations of harassment against owner Dan Snyder. Did that come up?
It did. These are claims of sexual harassment by a former member of the Commander organization against Snyder going back to 2005, 2006, in which she claims that Snyder had his hand on her thigh during a team dinner, and she was specifically put next to him for that reason, and that he also attempted to push her into his limo when they were going back to their vehicles. Now, Snyder has come out and said that she is lying, but rather recently, he announced that he would that the organization, the Commander organization, would hire an independent investigator to look into these claims. Today, we heard from Roger Goodell that it would not be that, but rather the league would be taking a look into this, basically saying that an organization cannot hire their own investigator to look into themselves, and that the league would step in. Although there has been some pushback in that Goodell has said that the findings of this investigation, at least as of right now, will not be made public. Hallie?
Morgan Chesky, lots to follow on that front today. Morgan, thank you very much. Coming up here on the show, lawmakers in Florida look like they're getting ready to ban conversations about sexual orientation and gender identity in some public school classrooms. We're going to explain this and why President Biden now today is slamming the so-called Don't Say Gay bill that it appears the governor of Florida supports. That's coming up. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg today saying passing a proposal like the one critics in Florida call the Don't Say Gay bill is absolutely dangerous for LGBTQ plus kids. Listen.
Tells youth who are different or whose families are different that there's something wrong with them out of the gate. And I do think that contributes to the shocking levels of suicidal thoughts and suicide attempts among LGBTQ youth.
He's talking about this bill that would basically ban talking about sexual orientation or gender identity in primary classrooms. Here's the wording specifically, that a school district may not encourage classroom discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity in primary grade levels or in a manner that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students. There's a lot of questions about that language, what specifically this means. And there's a lot of concern about it, including from President Biden, who slammed this overnight after the bill passed in Education Committee in the Florida State Senate. The president tweeting his support to the LGBTQ plus community, writing, "I have your back." Similar laws to this one already exist in Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Mississippi. And in Florida, you've got the governor there, Ron DeSantis, signaling support for this, too. Supporters of the bill say it gives parents the right to sue public schools for talking to their kids about issues they don't think are age appropriate. But opponents say, as you heard from Pete Buttigieg, it's a real concern. I want to bring in Kristen Welker, who's covering this story for us tonight about what's going on. Kristen, we don't often see necessarily the White House or President Biden coming out and directly condemning state-level bills. But this one is part of a number of bills across the country that have started to bubble up, right, that have started to come out there. Talk to us about the machinations that you're hearing about why President Biden is throwing his weight behind this and what you're hearing as you're reporting on this today.
Well, I think you did a great job laying out the back and forth in the debate over this, Hallie, and I think that's part of the reason why you're seeing the president engage in this debate. He sent out that very strongly worded tweet overnight, which you mentioned, and to your point that the administration is taking issue not just with this bill, but with other bills, particularly those that limit kids' education in their perspective. Let me read you a part of what the White House said overnight in a statement saying, quote, "Make no mistake, this is not an isolated action. Across the country, we're seeing Republican leaders take actions to regulate what students can and cannot read, what they can or cannot learn, and most troubling, who they can or cannot be." Now, of course, some of these issues are consistent with campaign promises that were made by candidate Biden when he promised to expand rights for the LGBTQ plus community. And so his opinion on this is consistent with some of those pledges that he made on the campaign trail. It's also, of course, taking a step back, noting that we are in a midterm election year, and so these battles are particularly fraught, Hallie, and I think we're going to hear a lot more about this coming from the administration and both sides, frankly. Now, to your broader point, how rare this is to hear from the White House about a state issue, because here's the reality check. There's not a whole lot that the president can do about a bill that passes in Florida. I asked the press secretary about that today. What more can the president do? Take a look.
Unfortunately, this is not the only bill or the only effort we're seeing across the country to really regulate what students can or cannot read, what they can or cannot learn, and most troubling, who they can or cannot be.
So the press secretary not directly answering what more the president can do. I think what we are going to see him do is continue to tweet and speak out about this as it continues to move through the Florida legislature. Hallie.
This is really personal for people in Florida, Kristen. You know, there's one supporter, one advocate, somebody who was part of the group that introduced this bill, who came out and said, you know, hey, this isn't going to stop parents from talking about these issues with their kids, between parents and kids. The teachers could still talk about LGBTQ plus history, like, for example, the Pulse nightclub massacre in Orlando back in 2016. But then you have very emotional, I think, response. And I know you're seeing some of this, and I've heard it too, from people who say, man, I don't want my kid in this environment, or I'm concerned about what would have happened to me if I was in that environment when I was in school.
I think the word you use is right, personal, Hallie. I spoke to a mom, Jennifer Solomon, and that's the word that she used. She said this is incredibly personal for her. She has 4 kids, and 2 of them are a part of the LGBTQ plus community, including her 11-year-old son. And so she feels confident that he does go to a progressive school in the Miami-Dade County area, but she's concerned if this bill were to pass, what it would mean even for her son's school, but particularly for other students all across the state of Florida. Take a listen to her message to the governor, who has signaled his support for this bill.
My child deserves to have the same opportunities that your child has in school. And so this is personal to me. This is my family. These are my children. And I could not believe that this is what has to be a top priority.
Now, Hallie, Jennifer Solomon really told me that this is a matter of mental health, and in some cases, it is critical to kids staying alive. Take a look at some of the statistics. According to the Trevor Project's 2021 national survey, LGBTQ youth mental health found that 19% of LGBTQ youth ages 13 to 18 reported attempting suicide in the past year alone. Those numbers are just staggering, and for parents, they are really concerning. And so this, as you say, is personal for these parents, and they are going to continue to speak out about this as this debate continues to unfurl. Hallie.
Kristen Welker, live for us there outside the White House. Kristen, thank you. We'll look for more of your reporting coming up on Nightly News. Appreciate it, friend. Coming up on the show, Nancy Pelosi now getting on board with stopping lawmakers from trading individual stocks. Why she's dropped her opposition to that. Plus, want free tuition? Maybe you should try to go work for Dolly Parton's theme park. We'll talk about how the icon is apparently helping some of her Dollywood workers pay for their education. Coming up. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, Mexico has arrested 3 people suspected in the death of a Mexican journalist. Lourdes Maldonado was shot and killed in front of her house in Tijuana last month. 3 other journalists have also been killed in Mexico already this year. Number 2, Joe Rogan seems to be clapping back again on the release of clips from his podcast where he used the N-word. Rogan's claiming it's, quote, a political hit job, and said he hasn't used that word in years. He's also turned down a $100 million podcast deal from the right-wing platform Rumble. They offered to move his podcast there from Spotify. Number 3, Elon Musk's SpaceX says it lost up to 40 of the 49 satellites it launched into orbit last week. Why? Because of a storm created by the sun that hit the Earth's atmosphere. SpaceX says the satellites will burn up. They're not going to produce any space junk that could hit us here on Earth. Number 4, the big merger between Discovery and Warner Media is one big step closer to getting done. The companies say their $43 billion deal has been approved now by antitrust regulators. They hope to have everything else wrapped up in the next few months. Number 5, Dolly Parton's amusement park, Dollywood. Guess what? They're offering to cover tuition, books, and fees for workers who want to go to college. The company has 11,000 employees across its 25 different attractions in the U.S. Leave it to Dolly to do something that makes everybody feel good. In Washington now, in a big shift, Nancy Pelosi is supporting a push to stop members of Congress from trading individual stocks. It comes as the first bipartisan proposal in the Senate to prevent lawmakers from owning and trading stocks. Was also introduced today, all part of this wider conversation to try to keep lawmakers from making money from inside scoops only they have access to working on Capitol Hill, stuff the rest of us off of Capitol Hill who don't work there might not know. This is a shift for Pelosi. She'd been against this kind of thing for a number of years. When talking about whether members of Congress should trade in stocks just this past December, she said, quote, "We're a free market economy, and lawmakers should be able to participate in that." Sahil Kapoor joins me now. Sahil, talk about this sort of change in position, the dropping of opposition here from Speaker Pelosi, because it looks like this thing now has the green light to move forward.
It certainly does, Hallie. Capitol Hill is buzzing all over the place over this issue. There's efforts in the House. They certainly are. There are efforts in the House and the Senate to ban stock trading. You know, there's a bill by Abigail Spanberger and Chip Roy, a moderate Democrat and a right-wing Republican who don't agree on much of anything else. There's a bill in the Senate by Mark Kelly and John Ossoff, two Democrats from swing states. There's another bill, a competing bill in the House led by Congresswoman AOC from New York. Some of these bills cover just lawmakers. Some of them extend to spouses as well as senior staff. There's a real desire among lawmakers to get on the right side of what is a clear divide, an insider-outsider divide. This is not a left or right issue. This is more of a populist versus elitist issue, and lawmakers want to get on the right side of this, it appears, including a number of candidates who are running in the 2022 elections in the House and the Senate, running in competitive campaigns and want to show that, you know, Congress should be more accountable, that it should try to build some trust, some of the trust that it has lost in recent years with the American public.
Feels like that last point's important, Sahil, because it does feel like this is a bit of a perception thing. You have this poll by a conservative advocacy group finding that 76% of voters across the political spectrum, right, that's Democrats and Republicans, think that lawmakers and their spouses have an unfair advantage in the stock market.
That's absolutely right. And the numbers are just remarkable. There's about 70 to 80% of Democrats, 70 to 80% of Republicans, 70 to 80% of independents in that poll all say that lawmakers should not be allowed to hold and trade individual stocks. And of course, this is because members of Congress are privy to an enormous amount of information, much of which is unknown to the general public. And if they're allowed to trade off of that, it creates a perception of shadiness in Congress. Now, there are existing laws to require disclosures. There's a Stock Act that passed about a decade ago that some members of Congress, including Chuck Grassley, for instance, a long-serving senator from Iowa, says this is enough. So it's not unanimous support for beefing up, laws, but there is considerable and growing appetite to move further and to strengthen these laws and prevent lawmakers from holding and trading stocks.
Sahil, do you know what I love? When you come on the show and tell us about what is buzzing on Capitol Hill, it's like my favorite thing. So I'm so grateful to you for bringing us this story. Appreciate it, friend. Bye, Sahil.
Anytime.
Some developing news now. The National Archives wants the Justice Department to look into whether former President Trump violated the law. We're going to explain why. These two administration officials are telling NBC News specifically about the way that Mr. Trump apparently mishandled something like 15 boxes of White House records. Remember, we told you about this? The National Archives had to have those boxes taken from Mar-a-Lago, where the former president now lives. This stuff was supposed to have been handed over at the end of the Trump administration. No word yet on if the DOJ is actually going to follow up to really investigate the former president. They apparently are considering it. The DOJ and the National Archives did not formally respond to our request for comment. Nothing from Donald Trump on this just yet either. We'll keep you posted. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day, and because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. New to us, just in from our D.C. bureau in literally the last couple minutes, the FBI and the ATF joining the investigation into a whole bunch of bomb threats called into 8 schools here in the Washington area, including Dunbar High. You might remember that's where second gentleman Doug Emhoff was evacuated from yesterday because of a separate, different bomb threat. In a statement, D.C. Public Schools says all students and staff were safely evacuated. From our Midwest Bureau, prosecutors today revealed some messages sent by the parents of Ethan Crumbley, the accused Michigan school shooter, on the day of that shooting back in November. His mother writing to a friend that her teenage son, quote, ruined so many lives. His parents are facing trial over whether they ignored warning signs of their son's potential violence. And the 15-year-old is being charged as an adult for killing 4 students. And out of our Northeast Bureau, a big water main break in Philly ruined a lot of people's mornings today. Look at this. At least 5 people had to be rescued from their houses in 20-degree weather after, see that video? Streets got totally flooded, buildings too. More than a dozen public schools had to close. Luckily, by about midday, workers had drained almost all that water out. So, gambling. Easier than it's ever been to do online, with more and more states making it legal. So, coming up in tonight's original, how technology has transformed the industry. You can use your phone to do it, and whether that could make it easier to get people hooked. To tonight's original, with in-depth reporting on a topic we've been keeping an eye on. I bet a lot of you are going to be watching the Super Bowl this weekend. I bet some of you might even bet a couple dollars, maybe a couple $100 on the game. Overall, something like $7.5 billion is expected to be gambled on this Super Bowl Sunday. That's a lot of money. And to place a bet nowadays, you don't even have to go to a casino. There's an app for that. Jake Ward reports on how online apps are fueling this betting boom and affecting the real world.
Harry Levant was a trial lawyer for more than 20 years. He spun into addiction and pled guilty to stealing more than $2 million from his clients, blowing it at this casino in a 16-month binge. This was his first time here in 8 years.
How does it feel being here?
I don't think I can describe it in one word. There's a lot of emotions.
He says it took feeling suicidal to help him turn his life around.
On April 27th, 2014, I got within 30 seconds of taking my life. I was trying to write a note to say goodbye to my kids. And I had a moment of clarity where I realized I didn't want to die. Gambling addiction wanted me to die. It was done with me.
Levant says it's harder to quit gambling today than it was when he did it.
I had to walk into this building to place a bet. Gambling is now being delivered on every single electronic device, all day long, all night, on every single sporting event, professional, college.
The ads are everywhere.
You can bet $5 and win $280 cash.
Bet $5 to win $200.
Load the Fox Bet Sportsbook app.
But this is not just a friendly office pool. This is commercial online sports gambling, now legal in 31 states and expected to bring in more than $39 billion annually within 10 years. The floodgates opened in 2018 when the Supreme Court struck down a federal sports gambling ban, leaving it to states to regulate themselves. The result has been incredible money for the industry and for the states. Pennsylvania is a perfect example. 6 months after sports gambling apps first launched, gamblers here spent more than $316 million in a single month. 2 years later, that monthly number has more than doubled, and more than $22 million went to the state that month as tax revenue. Using a phone to place bets accounts for more than 80% of sports gambling, according to sportshandle.com. It's always on, it's largely unregulated, it's harder to keep away from children, and it allows companies to track everything a player does. And Philadelphia, with legal gambling, 4 major sports teams, and a major media market, is a unique lab for the industry to experiment with new forms of online and real-world gambling. This old theater is slated to become an online betting lounge. It's one of 2 in Philadelphia that are a prototype for something that could happen throughout the nation. The operators of the planned Bankroll Club did not respond to our request for an interview, but have told reporters that patrons will use their phones to order food and gamble online. Harry Levant says this is not going to be just a place to catch a game.
This is going to be a public health nightmare.
Companies are offering online bets on everything and anything, down to the color of the Gatorade dumped on the winning coach at the Super Bowl. And for someone like Levant, that means no break from his compulsion. If anything, experts who study addiction say online casinos have all the data they need to know when someone has lost control.
I don't think most people are aware of how easy it is to tell that someone is an addict when you're looking at their data.
Levant is earning a master's degree as an addiction counselor. The NFL did not respond to our request for comment. But for Levant, the Super Bowl is a reminder of the growing power of the gambling industry.
They have converted NFL football into the equivalent of the same dice that I threw inside that building in the grips of a gambling addiction.
A new American tradition worth billions.
Jake Ward is joining us now from Philly. Jake, I'm so glad you're with us, and I'm so glad you brought this story to us tonight because it is fascinating, right? There is a level of detail there as it relates to, you can bet on the color of the Gatorade. It's also a huge industry. How are experts, what are you hearing from them about how do they wrap their arms around this and maybe start to try to rein it in, or is that, horse out of the barn at this point?
At this point, Hallie, we are 4 years into the Supreme Court essentially overturning the federal prohibition on this stuff and turning it over to the states to regulate themselves. But as you heard there, Pennsylvania, for instance, collects 36% on every dollar won. And so the revenue picture for a state that legalizes it, you can see why 31 states have at this point legalized it. And we're talking here about an addiction that probably affects millions of people, but that we do not screen people for. If you and I go to the doctor, right, they ask you, have you been smoking cigarettes? Have you been drinking? They do not ask you about gambling. So we really have no idea how many people may be affected here. But what we do know is that this incredible explosion of activity online has people really worried about the future. I was just speaking with a couple of different people who've been addicts in the past, and they say having this phone with them is like being an alcoholic and carrying vodka around with you all of the time. It has created an incredible problem at the same time that it's creating incredible money for the industry and for the states that have legalized gambling, Hallie.
Jake Ward, really glad to have you reporting on this for us tonight. Thank you. If you at home are struggling at all with your relationship with betting, there is help. Call 1-800-662-HELP to reach the HHS National Hotline. That does it for us this hour. Thank you all for watching us. I am off the next couple days. You will be in very good hands this hour. I'll see you right back here on Monday, though. And coverage picks up, as it always does, right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.